Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Kaitlin Rowe, a family educator with INCLUDEnyc, a New York City organization that works with families who have children and youth with disabilities. Today we have Kristin Glen with us, joining us to discuss supported decision making, which will challenge the widespread assumption that all people with developmental or intellectual disabilities require guardianship when they reach the age of 18. This is one of a series of live stream presentations that are aired on the third Thursday of every month at noon. We'll keep it to under 60 minutes. We also have a chat box for you to use, and we'll do our best to answer any questions we receive through the chat box. Welcome, Chris. Today's guest, Kristin Glen, has a wealth of knowledge and experience on this topic. She served as a surrogate judge of New York County, where she had jurisdiction over guardianships of persons with intellectual disability, and wrote several groundbreaking decisions in that area as well. She's currently a university professor and Dean Emerita at CUNY School of Law. Chris also represents a project called Supported Decision Making New York, which promotes supported decision making as an alternative to guardianship. Thank you so much for tackling this topic with us today and helping us expand our thinking on the next steps of adulthood for individuals who have developmental or intellectual disabilities. I'm going to start us off with kind of the basics. So, what is guardianship?
So guardianship is the way in which the state, the government, through the courts, takes away all of a person's right to make decisions and gives the right to make those decisions to another person who is the guardian.
Okay.
And I should say, I know that there's maybe an audience outside of New York, but in New York we have two different guardianship laws. One is basically for adults who have had capacity and then lost it through dementia or stroke or whatever, and that's called Article 81, so some people may have heard of that. But the law that's primarily used for people with IDD is Article 17A of the Surrogates Court Procedure Act. And the difference, and it's important I think, is that under Article 17A, if you get guardianship, there's no tailoring. There's no, he can make decisions about this but not about this. It's every right.
It's blanket.
Where you live, who you health care, money, education, job, everything is taken away.
And it's for life, right?
Forever, forever.
Okay.
Unless and until a court says you don't need it anymore.
Okay. And what is supported decision making?
So supported decision making, on the one hand, is something that's quite familiar to us all. It really grows out of the notion that none of us make decisions on our own. If you think about, I'm buying a car, I'm renting an apartment, I'm thinking about getting married, you don't do that in a vacuum. You do that by talking to other people, collecting information. And so the notion is that that's the very same thing for people with IDD, except that they might need more information or different kinds of information or information delivered in different ways. But it's based on the notion that everyone has a right to make decisions of their own, and we have an obligation to give them the supports that they need in order to do that.
And how does supported decision making differ then from guardianship?
Well, guardianship takes away all of a person's legal rights, and supported decision making enables them to maintain those rights and to make decisions for their own lives.
Great. And is supported decision making safe? I know a lot of our parents are probably concerned about some of these, and especially healthcare decisions.
Right. So supported decision making sort of as a process in the US is relatively new, whereas guardianship has been around for quite a long time. So I can't give you statistics on why it's safe. I mean, we're just really starting out. But I would ask the question, why do we think that guardianship is safe? Why do we think that guardianship does protect people? And we don't have any information about that either. So I think that what most of us who work in this area believe is that the more a person is involved in the community, the more inclusive their life situation, the more eyes that are on them, the less likely they are to be subject to abuse or exploitation.
The more connected they are.
Whereas if they're isolated, and I don't mean to suggest that parents are isolating their kids, but often that happens, then the opportunities for abuse and neglect are much greater. So we think that in the long run, supported decision making and helping people have inclusive and autonomous lives is going to be much more protective than isolating them and taking
Mhm.
away their
Mhm.
decision-making capacity.
Yeah, that makes sense, and you know, whatever way in which you go with that, I think the piece about inclusion and connectivity and having a community around you and different people supporting you is great. And in terms of even us making decisions, it's not always your parents who you go to. Maybe it's an uncle or a friend or a financial
absolutely.
advisor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, we
Yeah.
can talk about supporters in a while, because
Yeah,
they could come from anywhere.
absolutely. So tell us a bit more about the historical context, though, for guardianship for persons with IDD.
Well, guardianship has been around since the Roman Empire, but it was mostly for adults,
Mm-hmm.
and it was mostly about property,
Mhm.
as you can imagine. And so guardianship for people with IDD is really relatively recent. We were talking earlier, but in a more rural society, people with ID, lived in the community. They did the kinds of jobs that they could do. Literacy was not a huge issue. And so there was no need for guardianship, and also people didn't have huge amounts of money, and nobody needed to worry about that, and the family doctor knew you, and it was just a very different world. It was really sort of in the end of the 19th century,
Mm-hmm.
when we moved towards a much more urbanized society, that there began to be concerns about exploiting people with IDD and needing to protect them from that. And so the response was to put them in institutions. And parents were told, parents want to protect their children.
Right.
All of us want to protect our children. And the parents of kids with IDD were told, your child is potentially a victim unless they're in a safe place.
Mm-hmm.
And the safe place is an institution, Letchworth or Willowbrook. And so for 20, 30, 40 years, that's what parents who wanted to protect their children did. There was no guardianship. They were just put in institutions. And then, of course, in the 60s, we had all the exposés about the institutions, and parents learned, much to their horror, that what they thought was protecting their children was, in fact, endangering them and subjecting them to all kinds of terrible abuse. So when deinstitutionalization began, suddenly these parents who had put their kids in these places, these schools, where they thought they were being protected, had their kids coming out of these schools, which were awful. And the question was, what were they going to do? And so under the auspices of a number of parents' organizations, they went to the legislature and said, look, we as parents have legal responsibility and power over our children until they're 18. And these, our children with IDDD, are always going to be children. I mean, it's the myth of the always child that I think is one of the things that we have to work against. And so we want to have that legal authority. And so in 1966, New York passed a guardianship law for people with IDD. Okay. And that's where it came from. That law has basically remained unchanged since 1966, but the world has changed. In the same way that the world changed from the very first schools for people with IDD to Willowbrook, the world has changed from 1966, when there was no ADA, when there was no IDEA, when there was no special ed, when there was no inclusive ed, when people didn't really think that it was possible for people with intellectual disabilities to have full and admirable lives. And now we do.
And is there a consensus of guardianship evolving and moving towards supported decision making, and why might that be?
Well, I think, first of all, that guardianship is outmoded. As I say, the whole way in which I think most parents now think about their children growing and evolving is hoping that that's going to be moving towards independence and an inclusive life, as opposed to the thought in 1960, your child will always be a child. The problem with your child always being a child is what happens when you're no longer around. Right,
and with families moving all around the U.S., maybe, you don't have other siblings who are close. The extended family is spreading out geographically.
But we also now believe that if our expectations for people with disabilities, and all kinds of disabilities, are higher, they will reach them. So the problem was very low expectations, and so that's what you got. In terms of supported decision making, for a very long time, both as a matter of law and sort of the way people thought about it, we all believe that less restrictive alternatives were good, but the question was, what were less restrictive alternatives?
Mm-hmm.
And supported decision making, even though it's worked informally, obviously forever,
Mm-hmm.
and there are many, many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have never had guardianship and who are functioning perfectly well in the world and never called it supported decision making.
Right.
But the idea of it as a process and as a process that actually results in a document that people can use is quite new.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite new here, not so new in the rest of the world,
Mm-hmm.
where people have been working on this now for a number of years. It evolved out of a United Nations Convention on the Rights of People
Mm-hmm.
with Disabilities, all kinds of disabilities, that says that people have a right to make their own choices. And the U.S. doesn't tend to ratify those conventions, but the rest of the world has. I think as of today, 174 countries have. So they've all been working on this now since about 2006, 2007.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of work around the world. And I would say in the U.S., we've really been talking about it really for only 5 or 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
But it's caught on very quickly because people really want an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
They want their children to grow up,
Mm-hmm.
being able to make decisions, being recognized as real people in the
Mm-hmm.
world, and growing and learning in the way that our neurotypical kids do, from making decisions that are sometimes not so great,
Mm-hmm.
but learning from taking the responsibility of making those decisions.
Right. It's really rooted in kind of a rights-based approach.
Yeah, it is. It's rights-based, but it's also very much sort of the lived reality of what you want for your children.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want them to be always looking to you, unable to make decisions, unable to make choices, and then thinking about what will happen when you're not here to make those choices for them. So you want them to learn how to make good and healthy choices in their lives,
Absolutely.
and that requires giving them the supports that they need to do it.
Absolutely.
And so supported decision making in the way that we're working on it in our project, which we can talk about in a minute, I guess, it is really about being a little more formal about thinking exactly what kinds of supports people need in order to help them make good and healthy decisions.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on it, so let's jump right
Sure.
into it then.
Sure.
Tell us more about the Supported Decision Making New York project.
So we're the first really large project in the United States that is a pilot that's testing out supported decision making. And we're a pilot because we're figuring out what to do and how to do it best. And
It's new.
every day we're learning something more and doing it better. We are funded by the New York State Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, who believes that supported decision making is a really good alternative to guardianship and an alternative that parents should have. And so we have been tasked with figuring out how to do it, and how to do it for a wide range of people with a wide range of disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
different ages, different ethnicities, different language groups,
Mm-hmm.
immigration status. Everything that makes New York great and diverse is part of our client base. And so what we started out trying to do, and we drew on work that's been done all over the world, was to figure out a way in which we could facilitate people with intellectual disabilities to kind of formalize the way in which they got supports, and then reduce that to a document, a contract, with the hopes that eventually that document would be able to be used with third parties.
Mm-hmm.
Because much of the reason that parents and others get guardianship is because third parties like doctors or landlords or banks say, I'm not going to deal with your child who has CP because I can't understand them, and if I deal with them, maybe you'll sue me later, and I don't want that. So what we're really moving towards is a system in which we formalize the supported decision-making arrangement, and then the document that represents that arrangement is something that will be able to be used in the world so that nobody will ever need guardianship again, or at least most people won't.
Yeah, and it's kind of in the name of the project, but where is this available?
Well, we're a pilot, and we're just starting out. So we're in the beginning of our second year. We've been working primarily in New York City. one of our partners, we're a consortium of Hunter College and the City University of New York, NYSACRA, which is the New York State Association of Community Residential Providers, and the ARC of Westchester. So we started in New York to develop our model, and that model is up and running, and we're doing a number of facilitations. We are moving out into Westchester with our partner, the ARC of Westchester, and then starting in year 3, which will be next year, we'll be moving out to 3 to 5 sites around the state. I would guess probably Capital Region, probably Rochester, Long Island, I don't know where else. And part of it is just to figure out how to make this work, how to make it work for different populations, and we're already seeing, very different kinds of things coming out of different places, and people who are older. I would say that this is not just for 18-year-olds. There may be people who are 40 and 50 who were put under guardianship, 30 years ago, when it was just the thing you did, who really don't need to be under guardianship, and for whom restoration of rights might be what we're interested in doing. So it covers a broad range of people, and one of the things that we have been tasked with doing by the funder is trying to figure out how to make this sustainable. Because it's one thing to fund, the 10 of us who are working on it right now, but then how do we make this work for, 200, 300,000 people across New York State? And so trying to figure out how to do that is a real trick, and we can talk about that as well.
That sounds great. And I think you're kind of diving into, with at least the discussion around ages, a piece of the project, which is the diversion and restoration. Could you explain a little bit more about those pieces?
So technically, we are running 2 separate pilot projects, although they actually look quite alike. One of them is to divert people who are at risk of guardianship. So our primary client base for that in the first year or 2 has been transition age youth, because it's a time at which parents are told by somebody, whether it's in a doctor's office or at their school or from OPW or whatever, we can't deal with you anymore because your child is 18. So if you want to deal with us, you have to be a guardian. And you don't have to be a guardian in order to go to your child's school meetings. You don't have to be a guardian in order to deal with OPW. And so that's wrong information, and I'd like to correct it right now. But it is the place, it's probably the biggest entry point for people into guardianship. So that's the group that we're working with primarily in diversion, but we've been working with self-advocates and others, or just people who have seen something like a webinar like this, who are older, where the parents didn't do it, but now they're coming up against something. So it could be any age, but it's people who are not yet under guardianship and where parents or others are thinking this might be something we need to do. And then the other project is for people who are already under guardianship, and using supported decision making as a way of persuading the court that put them under guardianship that guardianship is no longer in their best interest and no longer needed in order to protect them. So that would tend to be older people, and again, as I said, because there were periods of time when just sort of everybody did it, even though not everybody needed it. There are a lot of people out there who are under guardianship who actually are functioning as if they weren't, but technically they don't have any legal rights. So that's a big audience as well. And I would actually say quickly that for people who are interested in that, it does involve going back to court. And we hope that using the model that we've created and that is being evaluated and that's very well thought out and hopefully well thought of, that when we walk into a court and we say, we've gone through this process and we have this agreement, and here is the system that's set up to help this person make decisions on his or her own, that the court will say, fine. But it does involve going to court. So another of our partners is Disability Rights New York, which is the federally funded sort of legal services agency for people with disabilities, and they will be doing all that representation for free.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So anybody who comes into our pilot and wants to go back into court and have their rights restored, we got free lawyers for you and great
That's
ones.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes, that's kind of a lot of probably covers a lot of the concerns of individuals.
Sure.
Is how to pay for it, who's legally representing me when I go back to court.
Right.
All of those pieces.
Yeah, so that's the good news.
That's wonderful.
Or some of the good news. Yeah.
So who are all the actors who participates as part of the work on the agreement and working on supported decision making?
Good. So the cast of characters in our supported decision making project begins with the person with the intellectual or developmental disability. And we don't refer to them as the person with the intellectual or developmental disability. We call them the decision maker. Because we want to make clear from the get-go that this person is at the absolute center of what we're doing. So there's the decision maker, and then there is the facilitator. The facilitator is a person who we have trained. We have a 2-day training and follow-up and mentoring and so forth, who will work in a 3-stage process. First with the decision maker, to sort of get to know them, to understand what their life is like, what kinds of decisions they're making now, what kinds of decisions they might be making in the future, about employment or about school or whatever. And also to identify the trusted people in the decision maker's life who he or she is already calling on to help, and who he or she wants, I'm going to say she from now on, and who she wants to support her going forward. And they work through a worksheet of, what are the areas in which you want to have help in making decisions. It could be healthcare, it could be education, it could be relationships, it could be money, and who are the people who you want to support you. What kind of support do you want? That's a big issue, and it really varies for people. And then also, how do you want to get your support? And so that's, the facilitator works with the DM initially. Then, after the DM has identified the people who she wants to support her, an invitation is made to those people, and the facilitator then begins to work with the supporters. And that's there's 2 things going on there. One is to educate them about supported decision making and what it is and why it's important. And also to what we are calling repositioning them from the people who kind of jump in to rescue and jump in to make the decision, to kind of holding back, as we all learn to do with our neurotypical kids, right? And support them in making their own decisions. And then at the end of that phase, and the DM could be there or not, he or she is at the center of this, he or she decides that. At the end of that phase, then everybody sits down together and they work out the agreement. And the agreement is about what we've called the big 4, the which areas, health, money, whatever, who are the supporters. And the supporters could be different people for different areas. So it could be, I want mom to help me with healthcare decisions, I want dad to help me with finance decisions, I want my sister and my friend to help me with relationships because I really don't want to talk to my parents about that. And then the what is what kind of assistance. So it might be, I just want you to bring me information, or I want you to help me weigh the alternatives. I want you to help me lay out what the consequences of a decision or not making a decision might be. I want you to communicate my decision to third parties. This is especially important for people who don't use verbal communications. I want you to help me implement my decisions. So it could be any or all of those. And then the final issue in the big 4 is how. So, I mean, that's about logistics. So say, for example, that you want your mom and your sister to help you with healthcare. And you would like them to meet with you and talk to you about a particular decision that has to be made. And that's what you said you wanted. And then we get into phase 3 and your mom and your sister are there, and your sister says, well, but we have completely different schedules. And like getting us both in a room at the same time would be really hard. So let's negotiate, and the facilitator obviously helps them do this. Let's negotiate a way that we could do this. So maybe I'll be on Skype and mom will be in the room with you. Or maybe you'll call me, or maybe you'll email me, or whatever. So that's just all the kind of how.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that families or friends or many of these what you call supporters are already doing informally.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of being formalized into this agreement.
But it's very useful to actually put it in writing, because then if things sort of start to fall apart or get a little fuzzy, there's always something to go back to and look at it. And then, of course, ultimately, we want this written agreement to be something that you can take to the doctor and say, I'm a supporter and I'm entitled to be here. The DM wants me here. The DM wants me to help communicate his decision to you and so forth. And that they would have to take that just like they need to take a power of attorney.
So this is touching on a great question that we got from our audience regarding the agreement. What's kind of the importance of it, and how does it differ from guardianship?
Well, in guardianship, what you get is a piece of paper from the court that says, I have a right to make every decision for my child or for the ward. They stop being a person, they become the ward. And you just, in theory, flash that piece of paper, and then the third party has to accept what you're saying. Even if the person, him or herself, is saying, no, I don't want that, or that's not my wish, you have absolute power. It doesn't actually work like that. We can come back to that for a minute. In supported decision making, it's always the person making his or her own decisions. But the supporters are helping them in a whole variety of different ways. So, for example, if you have a nonverbal person, if you went to the bank and the nonverbal person communicated with the supporter and said, I want to take out a certain amount of money or I want to open an account, and that was in the supported decision-making agreement, once we get legislation, the bank would have to accept that, and when the supporter said this is what X wants to do, they would have to accept it. As opposed to the guardian who says this is what I want to do.
Right.
And what he wants to do is irrelevant.
So in kind of the pilot stages right now, and as you said, before legislation comes into play, what's kind of going to be, the perception of doctors or bank tellers looking at this agreement? What holds that in place for the decision maker?
Right. Well, I have to be completely honest and say that until we get legislation, there'll be no requirement. And we're in a very litigious society, right? Everybody's afraid of getting sued. So when there is legislation, and when we started doing this work like 4 years ago, nationally, the idea that there would be legislation in the U.S. in our lifetime seemed pretty pie in the sky. But actually, there's already legislation in 2 states, in Texas and Delaware. I think there are 6 or 7 states already that have either set up commissions or are looking into it. So it's really spreading. And I think, and part of what we're trying to do in New York is create an evidence base so that we can go to the legislature. So no one is required at this moment to accept these agreements. But the third parties who are worried about being sued are generally private agents. And mostly where parents or others are sort of coming up against these issues are with state agents. I use the term state advisedly. So we're talking about schools, right? Or OPW. And so we're working now on getting an agreement with OPW that they will accept these. We're working with DOE on that. So I think the 2 sort of main areas in which parents or others kind of come up against some wariness about accepting choices from people with ID, hopefully we'll be able to take care of. In small towns, I think, where everybody knows everybody, the doctor will probably take it. In a big city where none of us see a doctor more than once ever in our lifetimes, and it's always like, who's on?
Always one.
Probably not. We need to work with DOH. It's all, there are multiple facets to making this work.
Right.
But hopefully that will happen. What I did want to say, though, about guardianship is that people believe that it's kind of a magic bullet. Like if you're the guardian, then you can make these decisions and no bad decisions will be made. And I know that I hear all the time from parents that someone has told them that the reason you need to get guardianship is because there'll come a day when you're in the emergency room and your child will need an operation and your child will be saying no, and if they don't get the operation they'll die and all that. So we had a very funny experience recently where we were doing an information session, and this issue was raised again, and someone stood up and said, I'm the guardian for my child, and this actually kind of happened. I was in the emergency room, and I said, I'm the guardian, and the doctor said, we don't care who you are, this is what we're going to do. So, so the idea that guardianship sort of automatically gives you the right and the power, even though legally you have it. Doctors are often going to do what they think they're going to do, regardless of who tells them. So it's just a thing to be clear about, that just being the guardian doesn't mean that you can always be the protector or that you're always going to be honored. And having a supported decision-making agreement at this moment doesn't necessarily always mean that it's going to be honored. But I think it's also part of an education process about society as a whole, that people with IDD are people just like us, and can make decisions, and can make good decisions, and should be viewed as decision makers and not as eternal children.
Right, and I think that's kind of getting into a question that I have about what are kind of the core rights that are embedded in supported decision making. What is the decision maker getting out of this at the end of the day?
Well, the core right is the right to make your own choices, and that's an international human right. It's in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which the U.S. has signed, although it hasn't ratified it. But when you think about it, I often do an exercise with people, and I ask them to think of nouns that describe who they are, or decisions that they've made this morning. So you might say, I'm a mother, I'm a lawyer, I'm a teacher, I'm a quilter, I'm a boater, or whatever. And when you think about those nouns who define who you are, they're all the result of choices that you've made in your life. And who you are as a person is the sum total of those choices. So if you don't get to make choices, you're not really a person. And if your choices aren't recognized legally, then you're not a legal person. And so it's a very profound right, and a profound recognition of who people are, and that they are actually people.
And we had a lovely discussion leading up to starting the live stream too, about it's not just the dignity of risk that you're talking about, that core right, but also the process of learning, which you've been touching on too, is if we don't make mistakes and learn from our mistakes, how do we ever learn? And so for individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities, it's kind of both of those pieces at the same time.
Well, I think, when people say, what do you say to parents? We all, of course, want to protect our kids. And neurotypical kids tend to learn how to make decisions in kind of an invisible way. You don't think, I'm teaching this child to make decisions. They put their hand on the stove, it's a bad decision, they learn not to do that. I think the kids with IDD may need to learn more. I think there's really a problem in our education system that we're not doing that in a systematic way, although we could. But you do learn by taking responsibility for your decisions. So even if a parent who is a guardian says, well, I always ask him what he wants to do, or, we honor his decisions, he's not responsible for those decisions. And it's the responsibility that is what really teaches you. And I think for parents, what you want to be thinking about is not just today, but you want to be thinking about 20 years from now, or 30 years from now. And will my now 18-year-old or 19-year-old be in a position to make choices, to make good and healthy choices? Or will he or she have been depending on me for all those years, and then what happens when I'm not around? And parents, of 18-year-olds kind of think, well, if I'm not here, the siblings will do it or whatever. But, 30 years from now, the siblings may not be able to do it. They may not want to do it. And then your child may end up really in a situation that was not what you hoped for them. And not to mention the fact that they haven't had a good and rich and inclusive life for those intermediate years. So I think that just the process of doing the supported decision-making agreement, I think that would have been so great to do with my own neurotypical kids when they were 17 or 18, to have them actually admit that they might need some help in certain areas.
System too.
Yeah,
there's documentation.
Yeah, it really is. So I think it's a great process, and even though it may not be legally binding on third parties at this moment, just going through it, I think we're seeing, both for the decision makers and the supporters, that it's very, very positive. That it's really a growing experience and something that moves both of them towards honoring the independence and self-determination. And you know, most of, obviously, the parents who are coming to us and doing this are people who are already committed to that for their kids, and this is just a way of furthering it.
Absolutely. And I that brings up childhood memories of my mom, who's a teacher, making us sign behavior contracts of what we would do. So I think it's a great parenting tip: is put it in writing, get your kid to sign on it, whether they're neurotypical or not. That can be a great piece to start to teach them and help them learn. I do want to touch on a question that came up from the chat box for one of our parents. For individuals who are IDDD and it's a profound disability, or for those who are nonverbal, how does supported decision making work for them? What should parents be considering when they're weighing those two options of guardianship versus supported decision making for individuals?
Well, certainly nonverbal should not be a barrier. We are facilitating several people who are nonverbal and communicate in different non-traditional ways. And the issue is really, can they make choices and can they convey those choices to trusted others? And if they can, then they should be able to make their own decisions, and the supporters should support them, and the world should recognize that it's their decisions. People with profound disabilities, as a rights matter, we believe that that everyone has a right to make his or her own choices. I think given the world as it is and the way that benefits and healthcare and everything else is structured, a lot of these third parties are going to insist on somebody who has legal authority. And so it may be necessary for a while longer to have guardianship. In the rest of the world, people are moving towards what we call facilitated decision making for people with profound disabilities, which doesn't take their legal rights away, and asks that the trusted people close to them do their best to determine the person's will and preference, and then make decisions based on that. And you know, it may look a little like they're making the decision for them, but it's a kind of difference in the way you view the person as an object for whom we make decisions, or a subject of their own lives. And it's the way that we who are close to people with IDD and the rest of the world looks at them that gives them their dignity. So I think guardianship, or some form of guardianship, may be important for people with very profound disabilities. But I think that we're seeing, and as we get further along in this project and we drill down to people with more serious impairments, that pretty much anybody can use supported decision making. It just may be a little harder and may take a little more work.
That makes sense. And we had talked about, you know, my personal experience being an older sister of a young man who has autism, profound autism, and is nonverbal, and we have guardianship as a family put in place for him, and we spoke before about kind of the safety concerns about that, and so I think a lot of us family members still feel, you know, very nervous and scared about kind of what can happen if those pieces aren't in place, and I think you spoke very well to the ways in which that approach is evolving, both in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. I guess my next question then would be, you know, moving forward as this evolves, who's funding it? How are we scaling this? How are we, you know, making sure that this pilot is accessible to everyone?
So, as I tell the people that we're working with every day, we're getting paid to make mistakes, right? So we're developing the model, and in developing it, we are learning how to train facilitators. We're creating manuals for training facilitators. We're creating a whole series of materials that DMs can use, the model, supported decision-making agreement, and all of that. And so the key going forward is going to be, how do we find facilitators? So we've been thinking about that a lot. One way, obviously, is to train people in provider agencies and to get that facilitation training funded by OPW as a habilitation, and we're working on that. And another is just to think about sort of who could be facilitators that wouldn't cost money or wouldn't cost very much money. So we're really interested in working with social work schools where you have these MSW students who have to do clinical work. They have hours to do. And not just social workers, and there are actually some BSW. We have a BSW program at Hunter now, so you don't have to look at people who are going $50,000 into debt to get their MSW, but also occupational therapists and occupational therapy associates.
Already in the field.
And the nice thing about that in New York is that, we've looked and there are like 15 OTA programs across the state. They're in many of the community colleges. There are master's OT programs all over the state. And social work and BSW. So those are just sources for kind of free labor. And we're finding that even though we don't yet have an organized program with any social work school, we're getting people are volunteering to do it because they really want to get the experience and they're really interested in it. We're also quite interested in training volunteers, and we're working in New York City, although they're everywhere, with an organization called Reserve. Okay. Which recruits retired professionals, teachers, social workers, and so forth, and matches them with not-for-profits. So we think that that's a really good source. And we're thinking going forward of faith-based institutions. And what's really interesting that we've learned from our colleagues around the world is that a wonderful source of facilitator are parents. Not of their own children, but parents whose children have gone through this, who see the value of it, and then want to do it for somebody else. So there's always going to have to be some infrastructure, but I think it's actually quite scalable. And when we think about these different groups as well, so we're talking, for example, about the OTA program at LaGuardia Community College and working with them, and with students from D75, which is the, people will know.
Do you want to explain what the OTA is?
So OTA are Occupational Therapy Associates.
There we go.
It's a 2-year program. And we kind of fell upon occupational therapy because what occupational therapists do is they teach people to compensate. So if it's a physical disability and you can't use your right hand, they teach you to use your left hand. Or if you can't use either hand, they teach you to use your toes or whatever. So often for people with IDDD, they may have some very good areas in which they're quite competent, and others in which they're not. So OT seemed like a great sort of training for doing that. And they do a lot of work around executive ability, which is sort of thinking and planning. So because it's the City University of New York and we have an incredibly diverse population, the OTA students at LaGuardia Community College speak, 40 different languages and come from all kinds of cultures. And so the students at Queens College that they may be working with who are in inclusive education may speak different languages. So in a way, the ability to use these programs really also gives us the kind of diversity that we need. It's very exciting.
That's great. And it's so nice to see that diversity. In fact, a question came in from our chat box too about if you're interested in being a facilitator, or if you're interested in getting involved in the pilot for supported decision making, either as a self-advocate or as a family member or friend who wants to support another individual. How do they get involved?
Okay, so first of all, I think there's a set of materials that you're putting out for people who are actually in the signed up. But we have a website. We have a really wonderful website. It's not perfect yet, but it has a lot of information on it. It's pretty easy to remember. It's SDMNY, Supported Decision Making New York, or you could just Google Supported Decision Making New York and you'll get to it. It has a contact us sheet. It has all kinds of information about what we're doing and how to become involved, whether you want to be a facilitator or you want to explore it for your child or you want to explore it for yourself. So I think that's the best place to go, and it has sort of hopefully everything that you need.
Sounds great. And you're right, those who registered for the webinar were emailed materials in advance, and then for those who might be watching an archived version of this, the resources will be available on our website too.
Oh, great. Super.
I think we had a question from Facebook Live.
Yes, we do. And our question is from Mike Wyatt, and the question is, can people under 17A participate in the program or in supported decision making?
Yes, absolutely. That's the restoration part of the project. And as I've said, there are many, many people who are under guardianship who don't need to be under guardianship, and for whom supported decision making is a really good way of being in the world and being able to make your own decisions. I should step back for 1 second. You said that I had been the surrogate, which is how I got interested in this. And as I was doing these hearings for people who whose parents or others were asking for guardianship, it just seemed to me like a lot of these people really didn't need guardianship at all. So for the people who are under guardianship now, under 17A guardianship, absolutely, they are encouraged to participate with us. We will assign facilitator. We'll go through the same process, and then when we're finished with the process and we have an agreement, Disability Rights New York will be their lawyer, and we'll go into court and we'll ask the judge. I should also say that we have, for our project, we have an advisory council, which has a number of judges and court personnel, so they've been involved in this from the beginning, and we'll be working out ways to facilitate going to court and making it as easy as possible. So yes, we welcome people who are under guardianship and for whom supported decision making would be a better alternative.
Great, thank you. I think we also had another question that came up, just to clarify and kind of circle back, because we've touched on so many different
Sure.
things. How would supported decision making differ from a healthcare proxy, for example, or a durable or just a plain power of attorney?
So in the United Nations, under the convention, these advanced directives are a form of supported decision making. You were supported by someone and you have chosen someone to make decisions for you. So you could have all of these things at the same time. You could have a supported decision making agreement, and you could have a healthcare proxy, or you could have a special needs trust, or any of the other sort of alternatives to guardianship that people use. I think the difference is that the legal standard for power of attorney is pretty high. And it's this kind of ability to understand and appreciate something when it's put in front of you quickly, and in ways that people with IDD may not be able to do quickly or in a courtroom, but with assistance and with time can do. So a person might not technically have the legal capacity to enter into a power of attorney that would be recognized, but they could make decisions and have those decisions legally recognized with supported decision making. So it just broadens the way in which the law recognizes people's ability to make decisions.
Great. And we don't have much time left, but I do want to get into, what happens before 18. How can parents start preparing their children for supported decision making once they reach 18, or how can others start thinking about supported decision making prior to that birthday?
Well, as I've said, supported decision making happens informally all the time. So I think that the really important issue is to look at your child as a decision maker from early on, and to both to encourage him or her to make choices and to take responsibility for those choices. Also, I think to really try to advocate in the education system for more formalized training for kids in making decisions, not just being compliant, but learning to make decisions, so that by the time they're 18, it shouldn't be an issue at all. So that they'll know areas in which they want help, areas in which they're perfectly okay making their own decisions. And if we do that, if we support people in making decisions from an early age, then this sort of 18, aside from the fact that it has some legal consequences, it shouldn't be a cutoff at all. It should just be a continuation of what's been going on.
Absolutely.
All along.
Absolutely. And we had talked too about, with my brother growing up, it was very important for us to figure out small decisions he could make in his daily life and support him in learning how to make those decisions. Like, having 2 or 3 different choices for breakfast and getting to pick what he eats and deciding on weather appropriate clothing. It doesn't have to be these big decisions about surgery, right? Like we,
or invest in your portfolio.
Exactly.
If only.
Exactly. It can be much more smaller daily decisions to start with and build on. And I think a lot of parents just naturally start doing those anyways, whether their child has an intellectual or developmental disability
Yeah.
or they're neurotypical,
Well,
maybe just at different ages.
Well, it's quite interesting. When we were first looking at the way people are doing supported decision making and facilitation training and stuff around the world, we had this wonderful woman come from Australia where they've been doing a lot of it, and she made us do an exercise in which the issue is really, are you a rescuer or are you a supporter? And we all, especially as moms, have a tendency to rescue.
Mm-hmm.
Something goes wrong and you just want to fix it. And it's so easy to fall into
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
And your neurotypical kids are probably going to fight back.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always going to be pretty, but they'll
Mhm.
fight back. And at the
Yep.
end of the day, maybe when they're 18, maybe when they're 20, maybe when they're 50, you finally say, all right, I can't fix it for you anymore. And I think that you need to have that mindset about your kids with IDD.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be a rescuer. I want to be a supporter, because I'm not always going to be there to rescue. And it's really important to teach. And you do it in small ways. And, I've been talking to teachers. There are best practices out there, again, as you've said, for learning to choose between, the milk and the orange juice, and then to make bigger choices and to expand the universe in which you make choices.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for parents, the best advice is twofold. One is, don't always be a rescuer. Try to think about how you want your child to be able to function when you're not there to
Mhm. rescue,
and also that you want your child to have a good and admirable and inclusive life,
Mm-hmm.
not a life of protection
Mm-hmm.
and of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And with regard to guardianship, I think it's also important for people to say, when they're thinking about guardianship, why am I doing this?
Mhm.
If it's just the school saying, well, you can't come to the IEP meeting,
Mhm.
no, that's not true. I can come to the IEP meeting, and my child can authorize it and should authorize it, and it's his choice, and the school then has to accept that. So, why would we do it? And from early childhood, how do we teach our kids to make good and healthy decisions? No different, really, from our neurotypical kids, except it just may take a little more work and a little more conscious concern with how it's done.
Mm-hmm. And I think that advice about not being a rescuer can also apply to maybe some of the professionals who are working with adults
Sure.
with IDDD about, person-centered approaches and providing the supports that allows an individual to make decisions on their own. I think is really important. We only have a couple minutes left. Is there,
Okay.
What would be the overall takeaway that you want individuals to leave with today from the live stream?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I come to it from a rights-based perspective, and I think that the right to be able to make your own decisions, the right to be recognized as a person who makes decisions, is something that's really important and has been recognized as an international human right. But I think that the word that we don't use very much in our legal discourse in the U.S., but which is very much part of human rights discourse, and I hope really resonates both with people with IDD and with their families and with their loved ones, is dignity. And it's the dignity of having the doctor talk to you and not to your parent. It's the dignity of having the banker say, what would you like? And not just assume that you have nothing to say about it at all. And who you are as a person is very much dependent on whether you are treated with dignity in the world. And it obviously doesn't just have to do with IDD, it has to do with immigration status, it has to do with gender, it has to do with race and many other things. And so people may have experienced dignity or perhaps being accorded less dignity than they'd like in many different situations, and they might be able to sort of identify and empathize with it. But for a person with IDD, the lack of dignity is something that really goes to the very fundamental of who they are as people. And so by giving them a right to make their own choices, and then by honoring those choices and by giving legal recognition to those choices, they are fully members of our society, which is what all of the work that people in disability rights have been trying to do for the past 50 years. And people with IDD are late in the game.
Mhm.
You know, mobility impairment and the deaf and the blind sort of came to this sooner, and now it's really time for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And supported decision making is just a very exciting part of that.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to wrap up today's session by saying that all of the handouts as well as contact information for Supported Decision Making New York was emailed out to those who are registered, and for those watching the archived version, again, you can find it on our website, INCLUDEnyc.org. All of our past live stream videos are also available, including today's will also be available on INCLUDEnyc's YouTube channel and through our website. Our next live stream session is called How to Talk to Your Child About Bullying, and that is going to be on Wednesday, November 15th at 12 p.m. noon. You can register for that. It's not our regular time. Like I said, normally we're the third Thursday of every month, so put it on your calendar now. Wednesday, November 15th.
I wanted one
Yeah,
more opportunity.
oh,
I wanted to thank you and Include
yeah.
for inviting us, but I also really want to thank DDPC. They took a chance. They believe in this. They believe in us. They believe that this is really an important way to give people with IDDD self-determination and dignity and good lives. And so I really want to thank them, because we wouldn't be here without them.
Yeah, and an extra thank you to you guys and to them as well from Include. Yeah, thank you.
And sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no, you're good. So if you want more information, though, about Include's events and workshops and resources, check out our website, INCLUDEnyc.org. And we hope to see all of you at our next Include Live, real conversations on parenting and disability.